So in today's video, I want to go through 5 things that you can do to optimize your recovery from a rotator cuff tear. And thankfully, we don't necessarily need to be too specific about which particular rotator cuff tendon or muscle you may have torn, because these 5 things are applicable to all rotator cuff injuries and tears. As a physiotherapist over the years, what I've come to understand is that we ultimately need to respect the injury and the dysfunction that you've sustained. But if we don't take a step back and try and understand why that tissue became injured and damaged in the first place, and ultimately try and address that dysfunction as well, then it can be very easy not to solve this problem long term. So if you're someone who's struggling to get your rotator cuff tear under control and get back to the things that you want to do with your life, take these 5 things on board, give each one of them a good go, and then see which one you find makes the biggest impact on your symptoms and ultimately helps you get back to doing what you want to do as quickly as possible. Now, the first thing that I think I need to explain about rotator cuff tears is this idea that we need to focus on more than your rotator cuff tear. What I ultimately end up doing with my patients clinically as a physiotherapist is we actually tend to spend more time focusing on other things that aren't the rotator cuff tear in order to help create a more optimal environment for that rotator cuff tear to exist within and ultimately help expedite the healing and the improvement in function and pain of the rotator cuff. It's easy to forget that your body doesn't function as isolated muscles floating around in space on their own. Everything functions together as a system. And I find the best way to explain to my patients what a rotator cuff tear ultimately means is that it's not an acute failure of one specific tendon or tendons to handle the things that you wanted to do with your body day to day. Essentially, what a rotator cuff tear ultimately ends up being is a failure of one particular structure to tolerate the environment that it exists within. So getting into this advice, the first thing that's really important with any rotator cuff tear or injury, whether it's an acute injury or a chronic injury, is we need to manage your pain. We don't need to fear your pain, we just need to respect what your body is telling us in the form of pain. And a great way to respect the pain that your body might be giving you is to understand that we don't want to rest your shoulder from anything and everything. We just want to limit it to the things that feel comfortable doing in the short term, so that when we get to these other ideas and your capacity improves, you'll naturally find that you can start to do more and more over time. Just resting your shoulder and divorcing it from all activity can cause other dysfunctions that you didn't intend to. It may weaken the structures around your shoulder, it may stiffen and tighten other structures around that shoulder, and it may ultimately make your brain more likely to create other dysfunction and dysfunctional movement patterns that we want to try and maintain as best as we can while we're chipping away at trying to improve the broader context that your shoulder is functioning within, improve your capacity, and ultimately get that pain under control long term. So if you are someone who finds that reaching behind your back or reaching above your head might be ultimately painful, it doesn't mean that these movements are bad for you. It just means we need to find a version of those movements that you can safely and consistently do over time. Try and modify the environment maybe so you don't have to do that as much, but we don't want to forget about those movements entirely. We just want to put them on the back burner to some degree while we build the capacity around your shoulder to tolerate those positions as soon as possible. If you're someone who needs to take pain medication, it's really important to make sure that you do so in a responsible way. If you can get away with not taking pain medications, that's obviously more sustainable. But if you do need to take pain medications, especially over nighttime in terms of sleeping, then that is a viable short-term strategy to consider, because sleep is vitally important. When you sleep, your tissue can recover and it can heal. If your sleep quality is terrible, if you're not getting enough sleep because your shoulder is getting in the way, then it's important to talk with your physiotherapist or your doctor to make sure that you can find a sustainable version of pain relief that is respectful to your body, but also helps you sleep and do the things that you need to do throughout the day more consistently. But again, we don't necessarily want to rely on that shoulder pain long term, because it isn't a fix for this dysfunction. So once you've got your head around how to modify your activity safely and responsibly use pain medication to help you cope with the symptoms that you've been given, we can now start to get to work on trying to change the function and the capacity of your shoulder, load up those rotator cuff tendon or tendons better, so that you don't have to keep modifying your activity or taking pain medication forever. And clinically, one of the most important things that I get my patients to focus on immediately with any rotator cuff injury is your upper back mobility. We often forget that your rotator cuff is just a group of muscles that anchor from your arm bone onto your shoulder blade, and that shoulder blade sits on top of your upper back. And when you move your arm in different directions, that shoulder blade will rotate and slide in different directions to give you the mobility and the flexibility that your shoulder requires to allow you to successfully interact with your environment. But if you are dealing with some stiffness and some tightness through the tissues in your upper back and shoulder blade, and it may not just be muscular tightness, but ultimately it is often joint stiffness underneath those tight muscles in the form of thoracic facet joint stiffness and rib joint stiffness as those ribs attach into the upper back. If that stiffness builds up over time, what it tends to do, it tends to short circuit natural shoulder mechanics. When you're trying to get up into a certain posture or shape, you can ultimately run into a bony or a soft tissue block that then means that everything else has to function or compensate around that. So if you develop some upper back stiffness and muscular tightness, it can then change the way that you load up your rotator cuff tendons, ultimately opening the door for some dysfunction to occur down the track. So if you have developed a rotator cuff tear or tears, it's vitally important that you take a look at what your upper back is doing, try and find some of that tightness and stiffness that may be there, and do something to remove that restriction to feed some normal slack back into that shoulder and begin to improve the environment that those rotator cuff tendons are functioning in. And as always, if you've been a fan of the channel, you'll know that I find one of the best ways to do that, one of the most comfortable ways to do that, is using a ball of some sort. And the best way that I find to do this, place the ball in the middle of your back, right onto the spine, but then moving the ball just off to the side that you want to mobilize. And then again, as we always do, you can lie down or lean up against the wall. And what we're looking for is we're looking for some tissue that feels stiff, tight, thick, or restricted. Now, this may not feel tender or painful in its own right, so you may need to compare sides to get a sense of which side feels like it sinks in easier and which side feels tighter and stiffer, just to get your head around what that restricted, dense feeling feels like. But what I want you to do is, once you've found that tightness, all I need you to do is put some pressure through the ball, encourage that tissue to relax. What you can do is you can lift your hips up as well. If you're lying on your back and you feel like you need a little bit more pressure through the ball, we want to get you to stay here. Take a couple of deep breaths in, squeeze the muscles underneath, try and get them to tense so that when you relax, the tissue gives and you can sink a little bit deeper. For anyone who finds that this may not necessarily be as intense enough, or you need a little bit more pressure, not only can you lift your hips up off the ground, but depending on how your shoulder feels, you can also come up into a range of motion that feels stiff, and you can gently oscillate through that range of motion as best as you feel comfortable, noticing that as you find a stiffness, you should then find that as you start to oscillate in and out of that stiff range, your arm will start to go further and further down until your elbow can hit the ground or the surface that you're up against. And what this is doing is we're using movement to shear free some of that stiffness and tightness, trying to find anything and everything that's there that shouldn't be there. And we're ultimately trying to feed some more slack into that rotator cuff, ultimately making it feel a little bit more comfortable straight away. Stay here until that tissue accommodates, and then what you should hopefully find is whatever range of motion that you had that might have been uncomfortable to begin with should then start to feel a little bit more flexible straight away. So again, it's important to remember that this isn't necessarily a rotator cuff specific exercise, but that's the point. We want to make sure that the foundation that your rotator cuff sits upon, which is your scapula or shoulder blade, and ultimately your upper back, is loose and mobile enough to support normal loading of that rotator cuff through all the movements and activities that you need to do day to day. So the third thing that I direct my patients to focus on when trying to recover from a rotator cuff tear or injury follows on from the upper back and scapular conversation from before. Not only do we need your upper back soft tissue and joint structures to be mobile to accommodate normal motion, but we also need them to be strong and stable to provide a foundation, a normal, structurally sound foundation for your rotator cuff to work within as well. So essentially, we want to make sure that your scapular muscles are really strong. And essentially all that is a banded rowing exercise. So all we want to do here is we essentially want you to do some shoulder blade retraction, where you're pulling your shoulder blades back and together towards the middle of your spine. Now, the reason why this should really respect your rotator cuff is that a lot of people, when they're doing a rowing exercise, complete the exercise by pulling their hands towards their chest. Now, while this can be quite useful, what I'll get you to think of is I want you to stop once your elbows get to your trunk, because I find this really helps people emphasize the shoulder retraction or pulling your shoulders back without dumping into a bad shoulder posture. Because if you don't have some range of motion in your shoulder, it's really easy that when you bring your hands towards your center, for your shoulder to dump forwards, deorientate how you load up your rotator cuff, and potentially irritate some of the structures in that shoulder. And by doing something as simple as a banded row, we can start to promote some more muscular strength around that shoulder blade to help support the rotator cuff from underneath. And if we couple that with better thoracic mobility, then it should start to feel easier and easier to get your shoulders back into those better postures. Because once we've started to create a better environment for that rotator cuff cuff to function within, we can start to progress to some of the more rotator cuff specific strength exercises. And as promised, the fourth thing that you need to focus on in order to help improve the function of that rotator cuff and get that tear and pain under control is we need to find ways to develop some rotator cuff strength without irritating the injury or without making it worse. Now, this can be a delicate conversation for a lot of people because if you do have a rotator cuff tear, using those tissues could potentially make it feel worse. So when doing this exercise, it's really important that you talk about this with your physical therapist, with your physiotherapist, or even your doctor or your specialist to make sure that this is an appropriate time for you to do this exercise. But the nuance of this conversation is that depending on which rotator cuff tendons you have damaged, it doesn't mean that you can't exercise the other rotator cuff tendons in a very respectful way to try and add some support and stability to the injured tendons as well. So for example, if you have injured your supraspinatus, your infraspinatus, or your teres minor, which are the rotator cuff tendons that sit at the back of that shoulder blade, these tendons are often responsible for externally rotating your arm. If any one of those tendons are your injured tendons, then it may not necessarily be the best idea to be doing a bunch of external rotation-based exercises. There are some versions of external rotation exercises that we can get to, but ultimately you might find it might be better going the other direction and targeting the other rotator cuff tendon, that's subscapularis. So instead of externally rotating, it may be better for you to internally rotate instead and start to develop some of that stability from the other side. And again, we don't necessarily want to graduate straight to active internal rotation-based exercises, especially if you have an external rotation-based injury. But what we can do is you can put your body into a neutral position and you can hold that position and stretch yourself out, thereby creating a drag going back into external rotation, but you're using your internal rotators to maintain that isometrically. And traditionally, isometric exercises are a fantastic way to get some form of strength and resistance training into tissue that surrounds an injured area or the injured area itself in a very respectful way. It allows us to load up that tissue, generate some of that strength to hopefully help that tissue function better. So if you're someone who has been dealing with a rotator cuff tear through the external rotators, that supraspinatus, that infraspinatus, that teres minor, it's really important to remember that when doing an exercise focused on those particular movements, either whether you're doing an active motion where you're externally rotating or an isometric motion where you are staying here in a good posture, fatiguing that muscle in a respectful way, the biggest mistake that I see a lot of people make, especially if this doesn't feel comfortable, is that we often find ourselves in a less than ideal shoulder posture. Now, if you are someone who is doing this in front of the mirror and you see that the line of your shoulder sits in front of the line of your elbow, then what that does when you're doing this motion is you'll feel a lot more tension and load through the front, if not the side of your shoulder. Ideally, when we're doing an external rotation biased exercise, you should ultimately feel it more at the back of that shoulder because that's where the muscles are that are doing the movement. So what I would recommend is that you make sure that you pull your shoulder back into a good position first. Again, shoulder posture, scapular positioning is really important, but ultimately start by having your elbow slightly in front of your shoulder and rotating around that elbow. What you should hopefully find is in a very short amount of time, you can direct the motion away from the front of the shoulder towards the back of that shoulder. And again, if you're someone who shies away from rotator cuff exercises because it doesn't make your shoulder feel very comfortable, it doesn't guarantee that shoulder exercise is bad for you at the moment. It may just mean that the position that you're doing it from is isolating tissues that it shouldn't be isolating and making it feel sore. But if you can get away with being in a better position and doing an active range of motion exercise with a band, that's completely reasonable. Or an isometric version of that exercise, if it doesn't feel comfortable going through range, you may just find that you can do it a little bit more effectively with your shoulder back and your shoulder behind the line of that elbow. Because once you and your relevant health or medical professionals have deemed strength exercises appropriate, we need to find an entry point for those exercises that is both respectful and somewhat challenging for those tissues to promote them to get better over time. So again, if you're dealing with certain structures in your shoulder that are damaged, we can strengthen the opposing side of those structures. But at some stage, we do need to try and engage the tissue that has been injured in the past. But paying attention to the position that you do those exercises in could open up a realm of possibilities that were closed off to you based on the position positions that you may have been in intuitively without even really knowing. And interestingly enough, this conversation brings us to point number 5. So the 5th, final, and potentially most important piece of information that I want to get across to you in this video is that the positions that you put your shoulder in day to day matter. Not only during the exercises that you do, but even more so in the inactive, stationary, sedentary, and potentially more boring things that you do day to day. So to cut a long story short, when you're thinking about the shapes and positions you get into the most throughout the day, generally we want to focus on the sitting shapes the most, because sitting tends to shape the things that we do most throughout the day. So if you're someone who spends a lot of time at a computer, using a mouse, a keyboard, whether you drive a lot, if you sit on the couch a fair bit at the end of the day, if you're someone who uses a laptop or an iPhone, or you play an instrument, if you're in a lot of positions where you're bending forwards and reaching down a lot, the positions and shapes that you put that shoulder in can open the door for dysfunction if given enough time. And what we need to make sure we're focusing on is that if you can recognize moments where instead of being up nice and tall and having your shoulders back, if you can pick on the situations where you might find you get dragged out of that position and then distracted from that fact for a period of time, whatever that position may be, if we can get you to think of that position and try and reorientate that posture back into a better shape, then you may just find one of the missing pieces to help you better understand why this happened, but also what you can do to create the optimal environment for that rotator cuff tear to exist in and heal in at the same time. So I can't stress enough that if you aren't paying attention, or at least trying to be more aware of what those shapes look like, and then actively trying to take steps to improve those shapes day to day, this may be an uphill battle for you to cure yourself or rid yourself of this dysfunction long term. And it's one thing to pay attention to your shoulder postures and shapes where you're doing something active, that's still really important, but don't neglect the shapes that you might just be in while you're doing the less interesting things day to day. But if I've come to understand anything as a physiotherapist over the last 20 odd years, is that you can't neglect your postures and shapes forever. They may come back to bite you at some stage. And if you are dealing with a rotator cuff tear or injury, this may just be the moment that you need to take stock of those postures and shapes and just try your best to be better forever moving forwards. So once again, I genuinely hope that was helpful. Please let me know in the comments down below which one of those tips you may have found the most helpful, and even which posture you didn't realize you were getting into the most throughout the day that you may now start to try and improve upon to further optimize the environment that that rotator cuff tear is existing in. But again, thanks again for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.